So thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. We're glad you can join us for today's session of Welcome of the Collaborative Science for Us Stories series. Today's webinar features a collaborative research project in Delaware examining whether biochar input from prescribed burns restores ecosystem services after removal of the invasive grass Phragmites. And you'll hear more from the team in just a moment. But as always, before we get started, as I mentioned, I do have some quick housekeeping things, which includes an introduction to the reserve system and the Science Collaborative program. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, the national network of 30 unique reserves, as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training and engagement programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaboratives program's mission is to support collaborative research that addresses coastal management issues that are important to the reserve system and that strengthens the system's ability to impact coastal management and decision making. And one important way we meet this goal is by sharing these collaborative science accomplishments publicly through a variety of channels, including this webinar series, the Collaborative Science for Our Stories series, which features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Webinars are both a way for us to share project impacts more broadly and also valuable learning opportunities for our program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing their own collaborative science work. For example, in the development of future workshops and webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies for our open access guide to collaborative science, which can be found on our website. With that in mind, we just want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback that you share, for example, in chat or via the webinar exit survey, may be used for program learning and development purposes. Please note that if we do capture a direct quote from you that we'd like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you beforehand to seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. Any direct quotes would be used only anonymously. So quick notes on how to ask questions and other housekeeping stuff. All attendees are muted upon entry, as you probably noticed. We'll be handling presentation-related questions via the Q&A feature. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and we'll plan to discuss as many as we can following the presentation today. You'll also be able to verbalize questions if you'd like to during the Q&A session by just raising your hand. Organizers will confirm with you before we unmute you that you're ready to come off mute when it's your turn to ask a question. Chat is visible to everyone, which I think I mentioned up top, but just a reminder, you can chat amongst yourselves and or use it to ask us organizers support or technical questions. All right, so with that, let me introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Andrew Wozniak is an associate professor in the School of Marine Science Policy, College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment at the University of Delaware. He served as the project and technical lead for this project, and Dr. Molly Yacano is the research coordinator and senior environmental scientist for Delaware's coastal program, and she served as the collaborative lead on this project. And I think Andrew is going to take over SlideShare, and while we're getting that going, I'm going to go ahead and drop a poll question in for folks to sort of get acclimated here. This is to everyone. Are you currently actively managing Phragmites? If so, what methods are you using for management? You can go ahead and feel free to just jot your answers down in the chat. And Andrew, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. Nick has covered a lot of the important aspects of our biographies here, so I'll jump right into it. Today, I'm going to present some work that came out of a proposal put together by myself and Carrie St. Laurent, actually, who was our initial collaborative lead at the Delaware NERRS. Carrie has moved on to working at NOAA, and fortunately, I was blessed to have Molly join the group here as our collaborative lead. The rest of our team includes two different facilitators, both coastal education specialists with the Delaware Reserve, Jen Holmes, who moved on to a bigger and better position, and Lynn Pusey, and the two of them were invaluable with helping to organize us and coordinate meetings with our advisory council. And Lynn was just spectacular in terms of helping us get organized and set up a end of the project workshop that Molly will talk about. Taylor Beck from Denier and DENREC helped us in the field quite a bit. Alina Ebling helped in the lab as part of the technical team. And then my three graduate students formed a lot of the work that became the technical portion of this project, they also were contributors to the collaborative part of the project. So this project emanated from conversations that Carrie St. Laurent and I had regarding prescribed burns and the use of prescribed burns in restoration contexts. So around the time that we put our proposal together, the city of Lewis, Delaware, had been arranging controlled burns in this red outline here to manage Phragmites australis in order to eliminate it. So these Phragmites is burned, as many of you will be aware. This is an invasive common reed that is really taken over in a lot of the mid-Atlantic, New England, and Gulf Coast marshes in particular. And it's burned to remove fuel for wildfires, to restore native vegetation, and also to rejuvenate marshes. Carrie and I both have biogeochemical backgrounds, and both have studied the incompletely combusted remains of biomass burning, sometimes referred to as biochar or black carbon. So this interested us because, of course, when you burn this Phragmites, you produce some kind of charred materials that may then have some impact in the environment. So Carrie, in her role as the research coordinator at the NERRS, put out a call within the NERRS Science Collaborative for projects exploring how controlled burns act to input biochar, impact erosion, and/or alter other tidal wetland processes. And we can't talk about this project without talking about Phragmites, of course. And Phragmites is, of course, this invasive reed that we don't, many of us don't love for many reasons. But some of the reasons that it is so successful in invading, specifically its ability to utilize nutrients and create these massive root masses and massive biomass stands, are reasons that we maybe should appreciate Phragmites a little bit more in terms of its ability to store carbon and nitrogen in soil. So it actually offers this biogeochemical ecosystem service. And of course, Phragmites is a big challenge for restoration professionals. It doesn't always stay away when we remove it, and native vegetation is not always taking back over when we give it the opportunity. So Phragmites offers this nitrogen biogeochemical service. So this is data from Wyndham and Meyerson. The data on the left are showing fluxes of nitrogen into biomass on the top and soils on the bottom. To the right are the corresponding native vegetation. And the take home here is that the arrows are smaller on the right side, right? So there's more nitrogen being stored within Phragmites marshes than they are in these native vegetation. The same can be said for carbon stocks in these systems. So when we remove Phragmites via burns or otherwise for native vegetation, of course, we may be gaining some ecosystem services for habitat or other means, but we may actually be losing some biogeochemical services in the form of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus storage. What Carrie and I wondered is that via the input of this biochar, so biochar has been used quite a bit in the agricultural and pollutant remediation fields because this biochar has some positive properties that allow it to do things like sorb nutrients and promote microbial processes and store carbon in soil environments. So this biochar itself is what we would call term refractory, meaning it takes it a really long time to be degraded and removed from systems. So we were curious to know if these prescribed burns of Phragmites for tidal marsh restoration through the input of biochar into the soils might end up recouping some of these carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus services. So we lose the services by removing the Phragmites, but the biochar input to the soils may actually end up storing more carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And here is a figure from Schmidt et al. That is simply demonstrating the the residence time of various classes of carbon compounds. So you have your lignin, alkanes, and sugars that last on the order of less than tens and to 50 years. And this fire-derived organic matter, which is also called black carbon or biochar sometimes, can last hundreds to thousands of years in the soils. So this provides a carbon benefit and has been a part of the justification for many agricultural and pollution remediation products. Now, of course, I've been focused somewhat on biogeochemical ecosystem services. Many of you who will be working in marshes and dealing with Phragmites management have many other ecosystem services that are a higher priority, or at least of a priority that should be considered. So water quality, nutrient cycling, and carbon storage are our primary focus. But all of these other ecosystem services, whether they be physical protection through wave attenuation, habitat and recreation via habitat for water birds, nurseries, and so forth, need to be taken into consideration when making some kind of a decision. So we recognize that there are no specific reasons or rather, there are many specific other reasons that you might be managing Phragmites. And we wanted to put the idea of prescribed burns into the context of all these other ecosystem services. So the collaborative part of our project, which Molly will cover later on in the talk here, tries to put those other ecosystem services in context of those burns. So we had two objectives to our technical project. The first is to quantify these biochar inputs to the areas within and adjacent to Marsh burn sites and monitor the black carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus densities. So these are our stocks within our soils, just the top 15 centimeters of the soils, at 3 different marsh systems. So the thumbtack that is yellow here is our Roberts Farm marsh here on the left. That marsh was burned several times between 2018 and 2021 to remove Phragmites. What made our study design really convenient is this Rocks Tract marsh is owned by the state. This Roberts Farm is owned by Delaware Wildlands, a nonprofit. They are separated by a boat ramp, essentially. And the Rocks Tract marsh was not burned. It may have been influenced aerially through the deposition of smoke and ash, or hydrologically through the transport of this material from the marsh to the Rocks Tract. But it wasn't burned specifically. So it made a really nice comparison between the marsh soils, whether or not we're getting some effect of the burns on these carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus inventories, because it controls a lot of variables for us. We also monitor the St. John's Marsh, the red thumbtack. That St. John's Marsh has never been burned. That is where the Delaware Reserve is. That marsh we sampled similarly to provide some context for the measurements that we're making here. They're not a direct comparison due to differences in salinity and vegetation, but they provide a kind of a different marsh perspective on some of the inventories that we're looking at. We looked at 10 cores at each site on 2 different samplings in 2022. Again, that when I talk about the burned marsh, it's this Roberts Farm marsh over here. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the data. These are data on carbon storage, at least in terms of the stocks that we're seeing in the top 15 centimeters. When we looked at depth profiles, there was no significant difference between depth profiles, so we combined all the data here. What you can see on the panel on the left here is the total organic carbon in the soils and sediments for the Roberts Farm, Rocks Tract, and St. John's marshes. And what you see here is that we don't see a strong influence of the burning on this total organic carbon. In fact, Robert's Farm and Rock's Tract are not significantly different in terms of their carbon stocks. So the St. John's Marsh actually does show a higher concentration of these organic carbon pools, demonstrating that this burning is not a dominant feature in terms of carbon storage, and that the site conditions are very important in terms of comparing these marshes. So it kind of drives home the importance of having these two marshes right next to each other, that have very similar properties in terms of location, and vegetation to make these comparisons. On the right, I'm showing black carbon data. So now this black carbon, I'm measuring benzene polycarboxylic acid biomarkers. So these are compounds that we know would be derived from burning. So they provide this clear indication of burning and inputs of what we would call this biochar material. And when we look at that, as we expect, we see this higher amount being input into and stored in these Roberts Farm soils compared to the Rock's Tract soils, and even higher than what we see at St. John's, which has the higher total carbon. So this suggests that you're incorporating this more refractory, and you can think of that as longer lasting, more sequestrable carbon forms into the soils at Roberts Farm, where you've had these burns. And that's important because if you think about a marsh core, not all the carbon that we're measuring here in a soil core at the top of a core is going to be sequestered long term. You're going to lose a lot of that organic matter and carbon as the marsh continues to grow and become compacted and is subject to microbial processes. But I showed you that figure previously, that the black carbon forms will become part of this buried carbon because of their resistance to degradation. So you may be gaining some of this long-term carbon sequestration from burns. We also examined these cores for phosphorus content. The quick and dirty on this is that phosphorus did not seem to have a response to the char at all. We showed no evidence for these prescribed burns enhancing soil phosphorus storage. There's no real indication of any significant differences among the different sites. This is our burn site. And we looked at both the organic and inorganic forms. We wanted to look at this a little bit more in depth. So what we ended up doing is looking at different fractions of phosphorus and those black carbon measurements. And so what we did here is we did sequential extractions of the phosphorus. We said not all phosphorus is the same. So maybe some of this phosphorus is bound to minerals or iron or the black carbon char itself that makes it more or less mobile than it would otherwise be. And the theory being here that if the char is providing this sorption benefit, maybe this phosphorus is not more or less abundant, but it's more or less labile as a consequence of the burning. And so to orient you on this, these diagrams here, I'm on the top left, we have an immediately available, easily exchangeable. To the right of that, an intermediately available and recalcitrant phosphorus forms. So these are the result of increasingly harsh extraction techniques. And so if we saw a higher better ability of the black carbon to sorb these phosphorus and store phosphorus in the soils, we would see a positive relationship between black carbon and maybe some of these more recalcitrant forms. We do not see that. So if you look here in our recalcitrant pool of phosphorus, there's no relationship at all between black carbon and the recalcitrant phosphorus. If anything, we see a potentially negative trend, but none of it is consistent. So we have none or potentially negative relationship between black carbon and phosphorus, So we're not observing any kind of relationship that is showing this black carbon immobilizing or storing more of the phosphorus. And I can tell you a little bit more about what I think is happening here when I get to the summary here. This says objective 1, it's actually objective 2. The second part of our project put together these biochar amendment plots. And for this portion of the project, we wanted to get at denitrification. So nitrogen may be more or less stored in the soils, but the other process that's been shown to happen with the input of biochar, especially in agricultural systems, is that you increase the conversion to nitrogen gas and off-gassing to the atmosphere. And what this does, of course, is that limits the amount of nitrogen then that is exported to the water. That improves our water quality because we're not in a potentially eutrophied situation with higher nutrient inputs. So we set up these plots. We cut them down, assuming that what we're doing here is burning a marsh, right, and getting rid of the plots. In reality, I think more or less what we did is put in these thin layer placements in unvegetated plots and allowed these Spartina alterniflora and Phragmites australis to grow up through these thin layers. Some of these plots were unamended. Some had biochar inputs. And then we also examined what was happening in reference plots outside of these plots in just natural Spartina and Phragmites. So the idea here, if I can point you to my cursor, is that the organic carbon and black carbon that is brought in and included in these amendments supply an electron donor. And that electron donor makes these bacteria, these denitrifying bacteria, happy, and it would accelerate this nitrogen emission from the soils to the atmosphere, lowering the amount of inorganic nitrogen that can then be exported from the marsh. So we hypothesized, we also examined the phosphorus. We hypothesized that we would get higher denitrification rates in these biochar amended plots. And if we want to benefit, these biochar amended plots should have higher denitrification rates than our reference plots in Phragmites, right? We're trying to understand if there's a better service than the previous condition, which is being the Phragmites populating the soils, right? We also hypothesized that these biochar amended plots would sorb allochthonous phosphorus, and you'd see higher soil phosphorus in the biochar amended plots. I'm in the interest of time, I'm not going to show those data, except what I'll say is that we did not observe, again, the phosphorus service. And I believe that has to do with the nature of the biochar that we're using. Not all biochars are the same, and I'll elaborate a little bit on the summary slide. Here are the data measuring denitrification potential. Again, the flames on the blue represent the biochar amended sediments. There's maybe an indication that the denitrification potentials are higher in the char relative to the unamended sediments, but comparing those to our reference plots, what we see is that the reference plots for Phragmites in particular show much higher denitrification potentials, and that we're not generating a nitrogen removal benefit by inputting these layer plots. So quickly summarizing the technical document or technical portion of the project, the black carbon inputs do show evidence for potentially enhanced long-term carbon sequestration potential. The total carbon that you find in the marsh is maybe minimally affected, but it's changing the kind of carbon that's being stored in the soils, and that may have benefits on decadal and longer time scales. Phosphorus and denitrification potentials did not seem to be affected positively by the inputs of the chars, at least in terms of a benefit over Phragmites itself in the marshes. Why does that happen? Not all chars are created equal. Sorry, it shouldn't have been that hard to spit that out. The chars that are used in agricultural and pollution remediation situations that show sorption benefits sorb phosphorus, they sorb nitrogen, they sorb your PFAS, PAH, and other pollutant compounds and provide benefits. Those chars are made specifically with properties in mind. The figure that I'm showing up here, put together by Novotny et al., shows what's known in the black carbon community as the combustion continuum. So if you think about the difference between a char in your fire pit versus your soot coming from a tailpipe, the properties of those chars or the char and the soot are quite different. One has bigger particles, one has smaller particles. That's because they've been exposed to higher temperatures. Maybe they have different sources of material. They have different chemical properties that are shown here in this portion of the table that lead to different properties in things like porosity, organic compound sorption, cation exchange capacity, and the abundance of these soft Lewis acids. An important component within that is pH. The data here that I'm showing are from a study looking at biochars for phosphorus sorption, I believe, in wastewater environments. And they found that the pH of the chars were positively correlated for all feedstocks as well as individual hardwood, switchgrass, and kudzu derived biochars, positively associated with the amount of phosphorus that was sorbed. And at low pHs, actually, and if you look at all the data down here, you can actually end up with phosphorus release from these chars. And that's actually what we observed in those biochar amendment plots. So the burns that you experience in a salt marsh are at temperatures that are much lower than you can get from when you make these designer chars at really high temperatures and that you then activate. So chars do have a role, I think, in restoration science in places like living shorelines, maybe thin layer placements. But we can't expect a burn in a prescribed burn to offer these kinds of ecosystem services without having a lot more control over the combustion conditions. So I will now pass it over to Molly, and Molly, you just let me know when I need to be advancing slides.
Sounds good. Hi everyone. So as mentioned, I was the collaborative lead for the project after my predecessor, Carrie St. Laurent, moved on to a job at NOAA. And today I'm going to be talking about the technical document and the workshop, which were both outputs from the project itself. In the top left, you'll see a QR code to our project webpage on the NERRS Science Collaborative website, and you can read our full technical document on there if you're interested. So the technical document's main goal was placing the role of prescribed burns into a climate adaptive tidal marsh restoration framework. And what this meant was we were looking at if you were using a prescribed burn for management of a system, how was it impacting the other ecosystem services that were occurring, both negatively, positively, neutrally, etc. And we did this based on what was important to end users within the state of Delaware. And we didn't expect this to be exhaustive because there was plenty of places, and I'll talk about it throughout, where we just didn't have the data. But it is a really great starting point for land managers and policymakers, especially as they're using limited time, resources, and funding to manage these marshes and decide how best to treat Phragmites. Next slide. So the ones that I'm going to be talking about today are the biogeochemical, the biological, the physical, and the recreational. We did also consider economic, cultural, and other services, but we did not assess them largely because we didn't have enough data to really make those robust assessments. Next slide. And the rating scheme we used was kind of two parts. Part one was the assessment of the impact on an ecosystem service. So this could be a negative impact. So if you burned Phragmites, this would negatively impact XYZ ecosystem service, a positive impact, self-explanatory. 0, which was no impact, and then unknown impact, which could mean one of two things. It could mean we didn't have enough data to even make an assessment of it, or it meant that we had data, but it didn't agree with it. There was an agreement. So in some cases it positively impacted, in some cases it negatively impacted, in some cases it may have been neutral. We also then assigned a confidence in our impact assessment, which ranged from 1 low confidence to 3 high confidence. So for those 1 confidence scores, these were areas where we didn't have a lot of data, we might have no data available, and there was very little to no regional or prescribed burn specific data. And then high was sufficient data was available, we had regional data, we had prescribed burn data, and moderate fell somewhere in the middle. Next slide. So starting with the biogeochemical services, this project was a biogeochemistry project, so we were fortunate that we at least definitely had some very regionally specific data that we were going off of. And we looked at carbon storage, nitrogen removal, phosphorus storage, pollutant removal, and greenhouse gas reduction. And overall, there wasn't strong evidence for positive biogeochemical impacts from herbicide burn restorations other than in carbon storage. And we did have that positive impact and high confidence interval in the carbon. You'll notice that with nitrogen and greenhouse gas reduction, we actually had a negative impact. And in the case of phosphorus, it was neutral. Pollutant removal also had a positive impact, but it was one of those ones that had fairly low confidence. Next slide. Next, we were interested in looking at the biological services, and this was kind of a heavy hitter because this is what a lot of land managers are really talking about when they're thinking about marsh management. And we looked specifically at native vegetation, invertebrate habitat, fish habitat, and bird habitat. And what we saw was across the board, removing Phragmites via prescribed burns would positively impact all of these. And we had moderate confidence. This is one of the areas where you really do have more data to go off of, even if you might not have as much regional data as you'd like. But the other thing that we saw here was that the effects on animals can be very species specific. So in the case of generalists, they're actually doing fairly well in Phragmites. So when you remove Phragmites, you get these specialists coming in that do better with Spartina. And in the case of land managers, those may be what they're actually managing for. So although you have things thriving in the frag, what you get when you remove it may be more preferable in some of those management cases. Next slide. The next service that we looked at were physical services, and this was definitely one of the ones where we had a lot of uncertainty or disagreement in the literature on how it impacted. So in terms of sedimentation, Phragmites actually was found to improve sedimentation. So when you removed Phragmites, that negatively impacted the marsh. In elevation maintenance, tidal flow, and coastal resilience, all of those were marked as unknown. Tidal flow and coastal resilience were because there was limited literature, but in the case of elevation maintenance, we actually found some studies that went both ways on it. Of sometimes when you remove Phragmites, you're gaining elevation, sometimes you're not. But one really important thing to note here was we found little to no burn specific studies. So in a lot of these cases, it was looking at Phragmites removal, and we were doing a little bit of extrapolating based on our other findings on how would burns then also impact it. Next slide. So finally, we looked at recreational and cultural services. And again, we had very, very limited burn specific studies. And this was probably the hardest place to find studies in general. You can see with our confidence scores, they're all hanging at that one low confidence. Sorry. And the impacts are largely tied to biological and physical services. So in the case of ecotourism and hunting and fishing, we assess those as being positively impacted by removing frag, because when you think of a natural system, a marsh, when you have these maybe return of more specialist species that are more preferable to someone who's going bird watching, to someone who's going hunting, to someone who's going fishing, that is going to positively impact those in turn. But in terms of the outreach, education, connection to land and spiritual, that really wasn't something that we had a lot of luck finding assessments on. Next slide. So there's definitely some challenges in putting together the technical document. We weren't able to consider changes across spatial and temporal scales, and the assessment was based only on the scientific study and evidence that we could find, which had its downfall because particularly in things like those cultural uses of marshes, those recreational uses, some of that is going to be much more anecdotal, which is great, but it's much harder for us to gather as we're trying to pour through hundreds of paper to put it all together into one thing. So that's something that we definitely talked about was how can we incorporate those moving forward. Scores were also based on the net. So like I said, in some cases, unknown meant unknown. In other cases, unknown meant we found a lot of papers and the papers didn't agree with each other. So that's something where it's going to be more site specific. And also in all of these cases, we are considering prescribed burns with herbicide application as well, since that is typically what's occurring. And so sorry. And so in that case, you're also having not only the impact of the burn itself, but the impacts of the herbicide application. Next slide. So moving on from the technical document, we had put together a Phragmites management workshop that was held just over a year ago. And we gathered 91 professionals for a day focused on management of Phragmites in mid-Atlantic marsh ecosystems. Originally, the plan was for this workshop to be on just biochar, and it kind of grew into more of a holistic thing from there, which I'll talk more about. And we were able to really bring together a great group. We had, of the 91 participants, we had folks from Delaware and Maryland state agencies. We had federal agencies. We had Delaware and Maryland towns and municipalities. We had NGOs like our National Estuary Partnerships, or Delaware Wildlands, Nature Conservancy. We also had a lot of environmental consulting firms and, of course, the academic researchers. And I think the way that we were able to get so many of these folks in the room together was that we worked with the Delaware Department of Agriculture to offer Phragmites, or not Phragmites, pesticide applicator credits to participants, which is something that for folks who are working in the industry and working at the state and federal level managing lands are requirements for maintaining pesticide application licenses. So we were able to provide those credits and give incentive for folks coming and also providing the workshop for free. Next slide. So like I said, the workshop originally was planned to just focus on biochar and the project itself, and it kind of grew from there. And what it ended up being our ultimate goal was presenting unbiased information on Phragmites impacts and management strategies using current research and on-the-ground experiences. So we spent the first probably 2/3 of the day. Of course, my computer wants to update itself. Snooze. We spent the first 2/3 of the day going through presentations of pros and cons of Phragmites, different management approaches folks have used, what has worked, what hasn't worked, where can we go from here? And then the other goal was to provide opportunities for participants to connect and share knowledge, ideas, and resources, including challenges and solutions for improved management. And so part of the registration that the participants filled out had the option of, I think, about 15 topics that they could choose from to talk more about. And the last third of the day they spent in round robin conversations where they cycled through the different topics that got selected. I think we ended up with 3, although I'm just going to talk about 2 of those. But they were able to talk about those topics more in depth. Next slide. Yeah, so the 2 topics that I'm going to present on are the marsh management barriers and solutions and emerging topics and opportunities in tidal marsh science and management. Next slide. So the goal of the marsh management barriers and solutions was to identify challenges and barriers, both experienced and perceived, in managing frag in marshes and discuss potential solutions. And the barriers that folks most identified with this were, of course, the logistical, lack of staff, lack of equipment, lack of adequate funding, but also really short management windows. So particularly in terms of, sorry, the sun is coming on to make me a little bit like Batman right now. Apologies. But the one thing that was really challenging for some is that, particularly in Delaware, there's very short windows where you're able to burn frag, and there's even shorter windows where it's actually where all of the conditions are met for that. So the weather, the having the number of folks on hand for successful burn, etc. There was also a lack of situational understanding of when Phragmites management will be successful and when it might not be. So with those limited resources, how do you make better decisions on when and how you're managing? Folks also identified a lack of long-term monitoring data sets and a lack of sharing data sets. So sometimes this data is being collected, but we don't know who's doing it. We don't know where it's being stored. We don't know how to access it. So how can we use that to make our decisions better? And we also brought up the communication gap between folks doing research and folks managing land about how to manage more effectively. Next slide. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. We did also come up with some solutions. The biggest of which was funding, and more funding, of course. But we also talked about better internal and interagency coordination. So opportunities like this meeting where folks are talking to each other and talking about their experience of what does and doesn't work. And we also talked about a mechanism for sharing and documenting results and lessons learned. Next slide. So from that, we came up with a few recommendations, one being enhanced staff training, another being incorporating extended monitoring into funding proposals so that we do get some of these longer term data sets. Also improving public engagement and perception around Phragmites management, helping them understand what's happening and why. And then more collaborative landscape management efforts. So like Andrew said, two of their sites were basically like state property right next to a property owned by an NGO. And so how do we make sure that we're talking to each other so that we're not doing something that doesn't align with the other to make everyone's job more difficult? Next slide. The second topic that folks discussed was emerging topics and opportunities in Tidal Marsh Science and Management. And the goal was basically identifying future areas for research, trial, and consideration. And many folks were interested in more pros and cons on Phragmites. I think that one thing that really called to a lot of people was that so much of it is site and variable specific. So there was more interest in how do we reduce some of those unknowns that we see in our technical document? How do we make more of that known? How do we understand why this site might respond differently than that site? There was also interest in research on how to live with Phragmites. So like we said, there is limited resources for managing it. There's limited funds and limited time. And so how do we decide where it makes best sense to manage and where it might not? Because it can help meet some of those management goals of adapting to sea level rise. Another was testing alternative management strategies and optimizing herbicide use. And there was about 25 other great ideas. Folks got very, very excited about these. So I can't, if I tried to put all of them up here, I would fill up the entire slide, but I'll move on to some of those recommendations. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Change slow on mine. So one of the major things, and this was the same as the previous topic, was prioritizing extended monitoring and sharing of data. And there was also a lot of interest in compiling the information from monitoring into a central database that we could then use for meta-analysis to predict management outcomes. And this sounds a little tricky, but there's actually an existing model for this in the Great Lakes called the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework. And how it works is, let's say you manage your plot of land with XYZ strategy and have XYZ outcome. And then everyone puts this in, you've got folks consistently keeping this up. And then I go in there, I have my plot of land, I have these resources and I want to try managing it this way. Like, how can I best meet those goals? And what can I learn from what has and hasn't worked from other folks? And then also people are interested in more opportunities like the workshop that brought together researchers, land managers, and industry partners. We heard pretty much all day long that a lot of folks hadn't had opportunities to talk with someone doing on-the-ground research, someone doing on-the-ground management. And so it really was a great opportunity for these conversations to be had and a great forum for future research. And I think that's all. Next slide. Okay. So wrapping things up, we just like to thank NOAA and the NERRS Science Collaborative, particularly Megan Brass and the team, as of course the Wozniak research team and the Denier team. None of this would be possible without all of these folks and a lot of hard work. And then next slide. And then our Biochar and Marsh Restoration Advisory Committee. These were folks that met with us quarterly to talk about the project, talk about the progress, talk about what we might do differently and how we might format the workshop and the technical document. And they really put in a lot of hard work on the project. So many thanks to them. And with that, we will take any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Nice job, folks.
So I'm looking back at the question and answer. There's two questions, and I'll go to them first. I see there's lots of chat as well, and I'll try to get to them next. Emily Baker asks, is there a specific process involved in making the biochar? I gather that it involves burning the plant material without exposure to the atmosphere to minimize oxygen intake. Is that part of this, or is that not needed? So, first of all, yes, making biochar involves a pyrolysis process where you take plant material and burn it in the absence of oxygen. That ends up happening naturally in wildfires as well, because the oxygen is quickly used up during the combustion process, and you form chars, wildfire chars. In the prescribed burn context, you're generating this char. The difference between what's happening in a commercial biochar is that you've got an oven and you've set it to a temperature, and you're making a consistent biochar. In the prescribed burn and wildfire case, you don't have much control over those conditions. So I hope that I answered that question. Anonymous attendee asks, is there a potential trade-off between enhanced carbon sequestration potential from burns and methane emissions due to the removal of frag roots, reduced oxygenation of soils? So I think the basis for this question is, if you are removing, whether or not you have enhanced methane emissions in either condition. And there is the possibility, of course, that you can enhance methane emissions. Methane, of course, is a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I don't know the answer to this in terms of an expectation of whether or not methane will be enhanced off the top of my head in either condition. I can make some guesses, but they would be hand wavy. I do know that methane tends to be a very short-lived gas, so there's the possibility there that those methane emissions maybe aren't quite as evil in this context as the enhanced carbon sequestration potential. Okay, did you evaluate possible transfer of biochar to the subtidal zone, i.e. impacts to submersed aquatic vegetation? We did not evaluate that. That would be an interesting thing to look at, especially if we're able to monitor a burn, right after it were to have happened, but we weren't able to do that. Going back on one of Molly's kind of challenges that she mentioned, the rocks tract plot was slated to be burned in 2021, and we thought, or no, 2022, and we thought, oh yes, this is great. We're going to sample right before the burn. It's going to be burned, and then we're going to sample right after the burn. Well, that marsh still hasn't been burned, to my knowledge, and that's due to the challenges in meeting that time window that Molly mentioned. In the state of Delaware, air quality is monitored and restricts burns to between October and April. And then within that, you have to contend with trapping seasons and hunting seasons and weather conditions, and they just haven't, it hasn't risen to the priority level to be done. But looking at any potential impacts and the aquatic vegetation would be something interesting to look at. Okay, I'm going through the chat. A lot of these are answers to our poll questions. Gonna look for some question marks to see if I see. Question on the biogeochemistry study. Are the marshes where the burning occurred tidal? And if so, how much of the biochar would be removed by tidal flow? And how would that affect the soil data you collected and analyzed? Yes, these are all tidal marshes. They're all brackish to mid-salinity marshes. Yes, we expect some effect of tidal flow. That was one of the reasons that we wanted to do the monitoring that we did, to make sure that we captured how much of that black carbon is being incorporated into the marsh. We did see the impact that it was enhanced in the burned marsh. but we don't know how much of that material may have been removed. I suspect quite a bit. And in fact, some of it may have been transferred to that marsh right next to door. Okay. Another question, why prescribe burns? The process of releasing carbon might help to sequester carbon in long term. So I think that maybe that question may have to do with the idea that you're producing carbon dioxide when you're burning the vegetation. And in the short term, yes, you're absolutely producing carbon dioxide, but that process also happens seasonally anyway. So seasonally, you're producing carbon dioxide as the vegetation breaks down. Right now, we're in a, I guess, what you would call a process of degradation, and during the fall, we'll go into the winter, and so and the biomass will start up again and bring some of that carbon dioxide back into the biomass in the spring. So that release of carbon with the burning will be mitigated within a year's time as the biomass that has replaced the burned carbon dioxide takes back that carbon dioxide back up. The sequestration has to do in the subsurface carbon. And the long-term storage of the carbon in the soil. So I hope that that clarifies that. Dan Kent, what would be the potential criterion to vet out where frag removal would be a priority versus keeping it in place? This is a very good question. And I suppose the priorities would have to do with the various ecosystem services that we're presenting. One of the reasons that we tried to present the material in our technical document relatively non-judgmentally is that we don't know what your priority is for how you're managing your marsh. We don't know if you just really love great herons and want to maximize the number of great herons in your marsh. We don't know if your priority is making sure that the upland behind your marsh isn't tidally inundated. So some of those resistance to erosion and coastal resilience may be your top priority. A beautiful landscape that doesn't have the Phragmites in your view so that you can look at birds may be your priority. Maybe if you're a wildlife refuge and have are managing for birders and so forth. Or maybe your interests are in protecting the water quality of the estuary and making sure that we have carbon stored in our soils. So those priorities are going to be up to the individual manager and to determine. I hope that answers the question. Chelsea Clifford asks, how about deciding where to burn, if possible, versus other control methods? This is something that we came out of our workshop as a really high priority. As we mentioned, that people settled on the idea that we have a limited amount of dollars in terms of restoration. We have a limited amount of resources, and sometimes often we remove Phragmites with herbicides or with herbicides and burns, and you have to repeat it on 2 to 5 year timescales. And why? In other cases, the removal and replacement with native vegetation just works. We see that in a case in Millsboro, Delaware, with a recent restoration. And why and when, does it have to do with hydrological conditions? Does it have to do with elevation of the marsh? We don't know. And that's why we'd like to see and we'd like to advocate for really compiling what monitoring data that we do have with as many different variables that could be contributing factors to the success of a burn or versus some other control method and the success. Because I think that can better use the restoration dollars that we have. See another question from Winnie Lou. Why Phragmites? What is the significance of the impact on leaving versus burning? Phragmites is in the mid-Atlantic and other places within the United States an invasive reed that has been associated with degradation of habitat. And that has been determined based on priorities set by researchers and land managers. And so leaving the Phragmites means that you have a marsh dominated by this Phragmites that can often take over and leave you with a marsh that maybe doesn't have the biological species that you prefer, or maybe doesn't give you the landscape that you want to have. And that has been driving the restoration community for some time, primarily fish and bird habitat, I believe. I see one more question from Rob on the Q&A. What's next? What plantings are recommended to replace Phragmites? Well, in tidal marshes, in any case, the answer to this has to do with the native vegetation that would naturally be in the marsh in question. So Phragmites can invade in freshwater up through pretty saline marshes. And in the marshes that we're dealing with, we're primarily talking about Spartina sinusoides in our brackish marshes, and in our tidal marshes, Spartina patens or Spartina alterniflora. And that's what we recommend in those environments. But the exact planting will have to do with the salinity regime, the elevation of the marsh soil, and how often the soils are inundated. You want a salt-tolerant species if you're in a salty environment, certainly. And then there are different abilities of marshes to withstand fluctuations in salinity and exposure to the atmosphere. They are a little bit specific to, environment specific, I should say. Okay. Chelsea has a question about how would marshes have historically burned, whether by lightning, native management, pre-colonization. Lightning is certainly still a threat to marshes, and there's lots of historical records of marshes, and that's one of the reasons that marshes burning as a result of lightning strike. That's one of the reasons that Delaware does burn Phragmites, is to reduce the potential fuel load from that. And there are records of natives and colonial individuals burning simply to have access. So if you knock down the vegetation, it's easier to get out to the water to go hunting or fishing